All right, good afternoon. We'll give you a minute. I'll introduce you and then come up and I can help you get mic'd up. Thank you all for being here with us today. I'm Beth Saunders, curator and head of special collections and the gallery here at UMBC. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to today's public event and reception honoring the exhibition Antonio McAfee Through the Layers Part 2. This exhibition presents part 2 of the artist's series of three-dimensional images inspired by historical photographs of African Americans, which were originally compiled by W.E.B. Du Bois for his exhibit of American Negroes displayed at the Paris Exposition in 1900. Through his reworking of those images, Antonio challenges dominant narratives and explores the construction of social identities across time. For the display at UMBC, we invited Antonio to spend time in special collections, and the exhibition reflects his experience conducting visual research here. The presentation features several new works based on historical images from our Rooks collection of African and African American photographs, as well as a selection of photographs curated by the artist. Tonight's program is a dialogue between Antonio and Shawn Smith, whose book, Photography on the Color Line, explored Du Bois' use of these portraits of middle-class Southern Blacks as a counter-archive to racist stereotypes then predominant across visual media. Antonio's work is itself in dialogue with Shawn's. In addition to her critical writing about photography, race, and archives, she's also a practicing artist. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to thank my colleagues at UMBC who made this exhibition and tonight's program possible. First, I would like to thank Antonio for working with us so closely on this project, and Emily Halver for her curatorial insights and coordination of the exhibition's many details and its handsome installation. I would also like to thank Larry Halver, Vincent Carney, and Ben Rybczynski, who ably assisted with preparing and hanging the works. I'm also very appreciative of my team in special collections, Susan Graham, Lindsay Laper, and Robin Martin, who supported Antonio's work in the archives and this exhibition in many ways. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to our event co-sponsor, the Center for Innovation, Research, and Creativity in the Arts, as well as the Departments of American Studies, History, Media and Communication Studies, and Visual Arts, who generously supported tonight's program. Finally, I would like to note that the exhibition catalog, as well as books by Shawn Smith, are available for purchase right over there. So after the program, please join us for a reception and you'll have a chance to look at those books. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Antonio McAfee is a photographer raised and based in Baltimore, Maryland. His fascination with history, portraiture, and what makes photographs drives his activities. He holds a BFA in Fine Art Photography from the Corcoran College of Art and Design and an MFA in Photography from the University of Pennsylvania. In 2011, he received a postgraduate diploma in Arts and Culture Management from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. McAfee has participated in residencies at Conservat, Spain, and the Vermont Studio Center. He was awarded a Civil Society Institute Fellowship, a Faculty Research and Development Grant from the Corcoran College of Art and Design, a Fulbright Grant to Johannesburg, a Daedalus MFA Painting and Sculpture Fellowship, and he participated in the Howard Silverstein Photography Studio Abroad program in Beijing, China. His work has been exhibited at the Corcoran Gallery of Art, Flashpoint, George Washington University Gallery 102, Hamiltonian Gallery, Institute of Contemporary Art Baltimore, Terrault Contemporary, University of Maryland College Park Stamp Gallery, and the Walters Art Museum. Shawn Smith, who I just learned was born in Baltimore, is professor of visual and critical studies at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she studies and teaches courses on the history and theory of photography and race and gender in visual culture. She's the author of several books, including most recently Photographic Returns, Racial Justice, and the Time of Photography, published this year by Duke University Press, as well as At the Edge of Sight, Photography and the Unseen, Photography on the Color Line, W.E.B. Du Bois, Race and Visual Culture, and American Archives, Gender, Race, and Class in Visual Culture. She currently serves on the editorial boards of Photography and Culture and the Journal of Visual Culture and has published essays in a number of edited collections and articles in journals such as the Journal of Visual Culture, American Art, Aperture, the African American Review, and the Yale Journal of Criticism, among many others. In the spring of 2018, she curated the exhibition Meridel Rubinstein, Eden Turned on Its Side at the University of New Mexico Art Museum, and she's been awarded fellowships from the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum Research Center and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Smith is also a visual artist, and her photo-based work has been exhibited in art galleries and university museums across the country. Tonight's conversation between Antonio and Shawn centers on shared themes in their work through the larger topics of art, race, and the archive, and we'll follow it with a Q&A with the audience as well as the reception. So please join me in welcoming Antonio and Shawn.
Test. Apples, oranges, pears, grapefruits. Thank you all for having me.
What did you say? Apples, oranges, pears, grapefruits. All right. So we have been invited here to have a conversation, and Antonio and I just met about 10 minutes ago.
Right.
So I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Yeah.
And I thought that maybe we could start by just talking a little bit about how we each came to the Du Bois photographs. And then the kinds of work that we did with the collection, because I was definitely working as a scholar and you were working as an artist with this collection. And
Right.
I think how we worked with the materials was quite different. And is my mic doing okay? It's on the other lapel. Sure. Better? All right, great. And I also want to thank Beth so much for inviting me to come and have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for being here, coming over from Chicago. I'm rather reserved more than usual because this is rather surreal for me. She insisted, and her work existed in my head for so long. And now I'm meeting her, it's all right, I feel willfully unprepared right now. But like her writings and Du Bois, on the Du Bois collection and my work with it, well, let me back up a little bit. Her writing on it and her work with it really shaped the way I thought about photography holistically ever since then. So I just wanted to preface it with that, and thank you for being here. But you want to talk about how we kind of began with the collection. Yeah. I can start off, even though I think your answer's more elaborate than mine. 2008, first year grad school, University of Pennsylvania. My aunt, Sheila Turner, was a social documentary photographer in Atlanta, Georgia. My mother grew up in Columbus, Georgia. She was also an Army brat as well. So we're quite transient in our early stages of our lives. My grandmother in Columbus worked for the Urban League, so helping families with their benefits, especially elderly, people with finances and taxes. So Georgia and Atlanta and Columbus has been in my life for a while. I haven't been there a whole lot, but my brother's there now. He's been there for a number of years, and we'll go there to every so often to visit family. And I went to visit my aunt at UC Santa Cruz. She's doing a graduate program in social documentary photography. And this is during my spring break at graduate school. And I went to San Francisco and drove to visit her. And the kind of last thing, it was a couple hours of touring the campus. And the last thing we did, she gave me a photocopy of 2 sections of photography of the color line. I didn't know anything about the book. I didn't know anything about Du Bois's collection either. Of course, I knew Du Bois from spending a year at Morgan State University, in which we looked at and read Souls of Black Folk. And I got introduced a lot of those ideas. It was spoke to me very personally. which is why it really attracted to me. It wasn't kind of like these binary, broad conversations or race dynamics in the country. It was like, who are you as an individual? Like, how do you see yourself within the context you're in? And that was a welcoming conversation for me at that period, first year of college at Morgan State when I first got introduced to that. But going back to 2008, I guess I'll be a little bit more personal, a little bit more open. But at the end of the trip, gave me this photocopy, and the girlfriend I had at the time was really annoyed that we weren't leaving right away, and she had to wait for all these photocopies to happen. I'm going to get this text. I don't know what it is, but I'm just going to get it. And just hang out. We'll get there in a second. So it caused some relationship issues. And I read it when I got back, so later that week, and I really got obsessed. I got really sucked into those sections, the introduction and then visiting race. I was doing work at the time about my father, autobiographical work. I was already digging into the family, interviewing my grandfather about his life. So I was already visiting their photographs, their early lives, mid-lives, 50s, 60s, and stuff like that. So it started to really form the way I was thinking about dealing with historical work. And reading her text, Smith's text, gave me a lot of confidence and authority and understanding of archives and collections, which she spoke about counter-archives. That's really powerful to me because as a photography student and coming up in wet darkroom photography, we talk a lot about collections and archives and my understanding in relation to them. I worked in photography collections at the Corcoran Gallery. I was an archive assistant for a retired National Geographic photographer at the time too, in college, excuse me. So I had a varied experience of photographs, especially historical articulations of it. And my understanding in being educated was they were pretty finite. Like they are what they are. They're saying what they're saying, and people come back and readdress them, but always at that point I had this really concrete understanding of what they were. But reading Smith's text opened up the malleability of them and how I can participate in that. And it gave me a lot of authority. It gave me a lot of confidence and authority that I can kind of go through this revelatory, discoveratory process of digging more into this work and figuring out how I can interject myself into that, either personally or through artistic, creative means. So I read that text all through grad school, and it wasn't until I got back from South Africa in 2011 that I restarted my practice. And I was like, all right, I'm going to focus on this collection, what I can do with it, how can I make it pertinent to myself and how I work with imagery, look at the imagery. Can it signal something contemporary? If I did this today, what would it look like? If I had to remake his exhibition or work with him series. So it led me on so far 9-year series of work to answer those questions. And I came back and restarted my life. I was in my mom's basement in Owings Mills, leaving my second grad school. And I started over looking for work. I started over looking for housing. I started over my artistic practice. And I was like, I'm just going to work with this collection. I'm going to apply glue to the work, to the prints, these inkjet prints, and peel it off and let that alter the prints. And we'll just go from there. It was a really simple, small impetus. But the intention was to have a snowball to something. So that started off with the beginning of the show over there with the figures in a imaginative sense having an agency to control the way they were depicted. So they can duplicate themselves, they can copy the background and cover themselves, expand themselves out, copy sections of them. So I started to get into this realm mentally where they had agency in the way they were depicted. And I'll pause there because that could lead to the other groups and so forth. But.
Okay, great. So, but you have been working with this collection for 9 years?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great.
Yes.
I came to the collection. I feel like my mic just keeps coming out again. Is it on? It's off. It's off.
Yes, I'm so very sorry.
All right. better? Great. So I came to work on these photographs really not by intent, kind of by surprise, and I think that this is, like for researchers, a really good reminder of why it's important to go to archives when you can. So I was actually working on another photographer who showed work in the Paris exposition in the American Negro exhibit, and that's Frances Benjamin Johnston, who was a white woman photographer, and she was pretty well known around DC at the time. And she was commissioned by the Hampton Institute to photograph students and professors and the grounds at Hampton. And Hampton really wanted to promote its educational philosophy. And so Johnston made a lot of very formal black and white photographs of classrooms and sort of students in action. But because she was using a large format camera, probably quite a bit like the one that's on display in the gallery here, and a tripod, and she didn't use a flash, she was working just with natural light, and indoors for a lot of the images in these classroom settings, the exposures were necessarily, just because of the technology, very long. And so people had to remain very, very still. And so these photographs that I think are quite gorgeous are also very formal because people are really standing still. And so I had a number of the photographs were reproduced in a book, and so I had access to the book through my library. But I wanted to see the prints and see what other materials I could find about Johnston and these particular Hampton photographs. So I went to the Library of Congress, Prints and Photographs Division, where they're collected and archived. And while I was there, this very friendly, fabulous archivist, said, "Sure, I'm happy to pull out the Frances Benjamin Johnston photographs for you." And I think they had gotten quite a bit of play at the time. People were really interested in them. And so she said, "Yeah, I'm happy to show them to you." And it's just sort of weird that no one ever wants to see the Du Bois photographs. I said, "The what photographs?" And she said, "The Du Bois photographs, the photographs that he brought to this same American Negro exhibit at the 1900 Paris exposition." And I said, "The W.E.B. Du Bois photographs?" And she said, "Yes." And I was like, "I would love to see them." So that was the first time I had ever even heard of them. And so at the time, seeing them meant looking on microfilms of these images. And so that's what I did. And you could even buy a copy of this microfilm reel, which I did, so I could look at it in my home library. And it took about 3 different trips to the Library of Congress until finally I think they realized, oh, she's serious. She really is working on these images. We'll let her see the actual albums, which was so exciting. But I wasn't allowed to touch them. So this fabulous archivist, Jan Grenzi, spent the afternoon sitting with me with her white gloves on, turning the pages in the album while I furiously took notes. And now I should just say that it's now all of those images are digitized, and so you can go to Prints and Photographs Library of Congress online and see all of them. You can download the images, you can work with the images as Antonio has, and so I think that's a wonderful thing. They're really working on the accessibility. So the other thing that was challenging about working with these photographs is that the images themselves were really well preserved in these albums, and I think that they wouldn't let me or other people look at the albums because the bindings on them were starting to disintegrate. So that was the part that was sort of delicate, but the images themselves were in great shape. But there was no notations about anything. None of the people were identified. The photographers weren't identified. There was no textual information at all. The portraits were numbered, and so I'm imagining, that somewhere there was a sort of list, of the names and descriptions of places shown in the album, but that that was not in the archive, and I've never been able to find it. So no text in the albums at all. The only information was on the spine. And so this gave Du Bois's name embossed onto the spine. And then there were 3 physical albums, but 4 volumes, and so you got volume numbers on the spine. And then titles. And so 3 of the volumes were called Types of American Negroes, Georgia, USA. And then the 4th volume was called Negro Life in Georgia, USA. So the other kind of clue that I had from Du Bois, it was just, of course, like all of the correspondence that he sent back when he was actually in Paris with the exhibition, that correspondence had been lost. But he did publish one short piece about the American Negro exhibit, and in that short piece, he said that viewers who went to the exhibit would find several volumes of photographs that, in his words, hardly square with typical American views. So I had that as the clue, the hardly square. And so I knew that he was, with these images, trying to make an intervention into dominant discourses and dominant images that people might be seeing, especially in the States and in Europe, about African Americans. So that's how I understood that he was trying to make a counter archive. And then it was a process of reading the images, reading this collection, this counter archive, against the other images and other archives that Du Bois would have been familiar with at the turn of the century, to try to first of all see, like, well, what is this image that he's trying to dismantle and re-envision? So I did a lot of comparative work, just thinking, and a lot of contextual work, a lot of work just thinking about Du Bois's own writings at the turn of the century. And I think he really was thinking in visual terms. So some of his dominant metaphors that he uses in The Souls of Black Folk, like the veil and second sight, I think he really is thinking visually at that time. So that's how I got started working on the collection, and finally then developed an argument about what kind of an intervention Du Bois was trying to make.
Mm-hmm. I really was fascinated by, I think you talked about Francis's work in American Archives.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? And correct me if I'm wrong, I remember reading it. Maybe it was what I was feeling going through at the time, but you being quite open and honest, straightforward about being critical of that work, and like who was documenting it and how was that being perceived, or who was being documented. Mm-hmm. Being hired by the Hampton University president. I was just kind of like thrown aback a little bit. How open and like critical it was. Like, oh, okay. They reinforced the importance of who's like taking that picture and what was the context in which it was done.
Yeah, so part of the formality of the images, there are images that are posed where the photographer is standing, right in front of a row of students, and none of them look at the photographer, right? All of them are kind of studiously bent down. And I think that it does set up this power relationship and this power play that I think Johnston was comfortable in reproducing, right? Like,
Right.
You don't look at the white lady visiting with her camera,
Yeah.
right? You are studious and you avert your gaze.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And I also got asked by a friend and former coworker who teaches at a small photography center, I know an exact location, Vermont, New England, something like that. And she works with indigenous communities. And she asked about my relationship to indigenous communities. Like, in my work, it's like I really don't address that. But I believe Francis depicted some of those communities in those portraits. It's the only instances I remember hearing about in the collection in which she photographed indigenous people and made this conversation of the whole collection overall. That was pretty fascinating to me as well.
Yeah, she did. So Hampton did, it was mostly African American students, but it did also have Native American students. And they, as you can see in the photographs, must have practiced some of the same, I don't know what to say, I'm tempted to say like cultural genocide, that schools like Carlisle did, right? So that these are Native Americans who are, in Victorian dress and with the haircut, and clearly from reading the photographs, the intent was assimilation into a U.S. culture.
Mm-hmm. I'll have to talk about in understanding the context in which Du Bois's counter. Through my research too, someone pointed out Hoffman's Race and Traits. I believe it was in the 1860s. And that was a text in which he wrote to justify insurance companies charging black people higher insurance rates. So this article was talking about a lot of stereotypes, reinforced a lot of stereotypes at the time, prone to labor, lack of intelligence, prone to high pain. It might have been a small nation of people. I have read multiple books that provided various insights into this collection. But it talks about that article, 1860s, being seminal and sparking on black intellectual refute towards a lot of racist ideology. And it was in academia, the visual culture, this was being played out in the black intellectual basis in a sense too. So it's kind of this air, this aura going around at the time. How do we establish an educational base, but also articulate we're as mundane as everybody else. There's a middle class, and how do we ascend to that? So I came into the collection really curious about, and still to this day, how do they, the black community, ascend from slavery sharecropper to the middle class? And the charts and graphs as part of this exhibition that haven't made work about necessarily, but I have addressed that through photographs and the people I depict, kind of filling this gap of like the intellectual pursuit, arguing, making a case for black people, also Du Bois's thorough data, economic and socially, that's part of the exhibition too, like how the income levels from 1850 to 1899, occupation percentages and levels from 1850 to 1899, migration patterns from that time period. So there's a whole wealth of data, but I was part of the work I do at the studio and research-wise, like filling those gaps. Like why was there a spike in 1890 of income? You know, it's very interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know there was a spike in 1890 in income. That's fascinating. And have you seen the book that's been recently published of all of those charts and graphs?
Yeah, I brought it with me.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Yeah, it's fabulous. And so as Antonio is mentioning, Du Bois sent these photo albums to the Paris expositions, and then he was teaching at Atlanta University at the time, and so he worked with students to make all of these lovely color charts and graphs based on sociological data. And so about income, about where people lived, rural or urban, education levels, and so that was another whole display. And then he also had someone transcribe all of the Georgia state laws that pertained to African Americans, right? So I think that's also interesting to think about him, like working as a sociologist at that moment too, right? And thinking about photography in that context, right, as another kind of really sociological data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that combination was really, it's really key. It changed the way I started thinking about photography. I started thinking about photography in that way, like impact and how it related to social issues, or describing it, articulating it, or depicting it. So at that point of reading your book, I couldn't separate it. And once I found out Du Bois dealt with photography, I was like, whoa. Like that was it for me. I no longer think the same way about photography again. Yeah. And I teach with a big part of the mission is to articulate the practical implications of photography. Like what did it actually do and impact people, and laws, legislation, perception, understanding of others, like practically realistic, what did it do? So Lewis Hines is in here, a big part of that. Yeah.
And you said that your aunt was a documentary photographer?
Mhm.
Okay, yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting too.
She did long-term projects. So she's spent decades photographing her neighborhood, for example.
Wow.
Out the door and around the corner is a big project of hers. It's just showing local areas in addition to museums and all that stuff too. But she's very much into local community and teaching. She taught at Duke for a little bit, but mainly nonprofits in Georgia and Atlanta, and photographing people around her. She's actually really strict to photography. We would argue back and forth. I'm very experimental and I go all over, but she was like, no. She's very tough.
So I want to hear more about like how you made some of your selections, because so we're talking about Du Bois, and I think that it's important to just emphasize that Du Bois collected these photographs and put his name on the spine. So I think he saw himself as curator, but many of the formal portraits that you and I were both really drawn to were made by Thomas Askew, who was a prominent African-American photographer in Atlanta at the time. And he kind of catered to a black elite in Atlanta. And so I think that I don't usually think of these formal middle class portrait, studio portrait, as socio-documentary work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's interesting, and Du Bois sort of suggesting that they do provide kind of evidence and data. And this is the era of Du Bois and the talented temp, right? I mean, Du Bois keeps changing over his intellectual life, and I think that's one of the things that's so wonderful about his work. But in this moment, like, he was quite the kind of Victorian gentleman, talented tenth, right? Like, it was the wealthy and the educated, like, that's where social change was going to happen, right? This is not the Du Bois of Black Reconstruction, right?
Right.
This is that, like, where he turns to the working class, right? This is the kind of middle and upper middle class is where his hopes are. So did you think about working with any of the images that are maybe more traditionally socio-documentary, like the ones in Negro life in Georgia, or did you just see the portraits and say those are the images?
The portraits. Is about the depiction, the age and range of complexions and individuals, their attire, and the outfits. Well, some of the pictures I picked just because of the frills and the way they respond to the 3D effect. You know, they bring so much out within the figure. I really, later on in particular, I wanted to kind of respond with the viewer too. And I've been doing portraiture from the very beginning. It wasn't until 2011 I'm a portrait artist. Like, all right, this is it. Like, I'm not. And I was kind of scared because I'm used to doing so many different things. But the pinpointing down to be really specific was really key. So just the portraits really struck me, and I felt like working out ways to manipulate the inkjet prints that would download from the Library of Congress, and dealing with 363 individuals, like, how, I didn't really rush anything. It's like kind of to start and have it snowball. So I was just really focused on the way they were depicted, the diversity of the individuals. I haven't touched the physical prints or seen them, but the tonality and the Victorian oval format, the physicality of photographs has really struck me too. Everything was aesthetically gorgeous and ripe to be edited. So I stuck with just the portraits. I have been gearing up to work on the charts and graphs as well. I've been collecting data since maybe 2013. William Julius Wilson's been, a statistician's been instrumental in that.
Do you want to say more about like how
Sure, thank
you
you.
are actually physically working with the images? Because I think it's fascinating, and where you started with these that I'm looking at right here. Is that right? The ones with the kind of the transfers,
The composites,
the
the
composite.
ovals.
Yes,
Um,
or maybe not. I mean, I'm
those
really
are before
interested.
the 3D ones, though.
Okay, great. So like, what was that process, and then how did you, even imagine going to 3D?
Composite Portraits, again, influenced by your book. In the Body and Archive by Albin, who talked about composite portraits in honorific and repressive ways, Galton and Bertolone using them. And so in the trajectory, the work starts off with digital manipulation and figures manipulating the scene within itself, and not a whole lot added to it. Then now you see more contemporary, more recent iteration of these figures. In the After the Deluge piece, right behind that wall, the black piece that is a transfer drapery type piece. But the oval portraits were somewhere in the middle of the digital manipulation and the collage or building figure work. It's all going through this trajectory, transformation, one state to another, but that's like the in-between state within that one depiction or another. They're showing multiple at the same time. It's 4 copies made of each individual 8 by 10s. I put glue on each figure. When the glue dries, I peel it off. Some of the ink is left on the print. Some of the ink is on the glue. And for those, I would scan those prints in, overlap them in Photoshop, each a layer, and play with the opacity so each layer will come out in different parts. Use the erase tool to erase parts of it, selectively making parts darker or lighter. So it's significant to have the tonal range of white, all these variations of grays and black. White and black and the certain grays are each different photograph. It's important to show them in different stages simultaneously. In the oval shape, that's the embryonic form in which they're forming in as well. That's what those look like in the middle stage. So starting off with the digital manipulation, there's 2 photographs that are very similar in the front part of the exhibition on the left. Me facing on the left. So this trickster, I think it's transitioned or blended. So the figure's doubled, reversed, and doubled and overlapping. And there's a black and white version of that, and there's a 3D version of that right next to each other. The black and white one came into experimenting of how to depict these figures as if they can control the way they're depicted and kind of mess with perception and kind of throw people off and not give them what they expected. But give them a certain amount of agency, really. Then that image alluded to looking at the photograph cross-eyed and making an image like that versus like inducing that in the viewer. But I was reading Jonathan Curry's Techniques of the Observer, Modernity and Vision in the 19th century, 19th century modernity and vision. And he discusses and argues what really happened in the invention of photography. The important thing wasn't necessarily the apparatus being invented, the camera, and that representing reality accurately and masterfully, but it implemented the viewer. It gave the viewer more instances of perception and incorporated them in vision as well. So for example, like after images, he would argue. He used an example of Turner's Morning After the Deluge and how that is simultaneously an image of looking at the sun and an image of the viewer's after images of looking at the sun. So we're simultaneously looking at the image and generating the image. And he argued that's what photography brought into the fold. Like we became more part of the vision and act of looking, and we got enacted more physically. So the 3D images were an exercise in articulating that. And then the research for those 3D images, I did some experiments to figure out what type of 3D, and if I'm using magic eye stuff, how can I physically affect the way people see? Doing some more research, Dr. Bolato, neuroscientist, studies color and perception. And one thing that he said that really stuck with me is that we evolved to see for survival, not accuracy. And I was like, what does that mean? That's interesting. So for example, it's important for us to see color, so we can see a black panther in green foliage. If we only saw in black and white, we'll be eaten. So he studies animals and insects too. And we does like TED Talks and all these things. He has color examples. So that's interesting. So he was physically manipulating the way people saw. So did that change the way people understood things or individuals? So I'm still answering that question, but I just started messing with the way people saw. But also in that too, when I first showed that work in 2016 at your whole contemporary, I set it up where there's a solely blue image and a red image, a diptych next to each other, and the 3D glasses are there with the exhibition text. So they're looking at the intro panel, which is what that image is called, and seeing how the images are made, what they're made of, how the 3D effect works. Then they go into the show and see all the blended work. So I wanted them to come in already doubting and questioning what's been offered to them and let them know off bat that they've been being manipulated and played. But here's the rule book, like here it is. And maybe we should be more skeptical of images. And truth in photographs is probably the oldest conversation there is in photography. I can't escape it quite yet, but I will one day. So coming off bat, just not taking it for granted. So for the creation of these, kind of go back to your question, I duplicate the figure, I flip one horizontally, create a separate layer, overlap them. One version's red, one version's blue that I control in channels. The first thing I have to do is actually convert these grayscale images from the Library of Congress into RGB. So I have to give them color they don't technically have. Yeah, and that's the same for all of them, really. It's very interesting, this series, this subgenre of the whole body of work kind of expanded, because I was quite insecure for a little bit of time after this, because it was quite a simple process. I'm used to all these water baths and transfers and scale prints and on glass. But it was more concise than I kind of thought before, really. So the 3D classes came into the fold, so inviting people to see the way I want them to see. After looking at the images, half a minute to a minute, maybe longer, they take the glasses off and they see an after image of the figure on the wall too. So they're internalizing my forced perspective on them.
I love the way the 3D effect also, it makes them kind of pop into the room. And also, I don't think this was just the trick of my eyes. I think you made this trick happen. They seem to flicker, like, so that I would see the 3D effect, for like right profile and then left profile, as if the figure was sort of moving in the space with me, which I thought was really fascinating and very powerful. Like you animated them. It was really, really amazing.
Yep, trying to do impossible, creating motion in still image. So I don't perfectly align them. So that's why they respond differently. Some parts of disappear, some part appear. Hopefully people look at them with one eye open, switch back and forth, so they're not static. They're shifting right in front of you, so therefore the possibilities that we'll be able to understand about them hopefully will open up. And the stage I'm at now, I'm thinking about the work, is putting people in inexplicable instances. I haven't quite figured out. I'm quite reserved about dictating how they look at the end. I'm kind of unsure about how much to make finite their final depiction, in the hopes that maybe we'll end up in a space that's more open, and that's okay, and maybe we'll come to people more open. And it's like, all right, you're like this now, but maybe you'll be a little different 5 minutes later or tomorrow. Or, I understand this person now, but they're moving back and forth, so I have to consider multiple possibilities simultaneously versus the image is just this moment and just like this for all the time.
Are you going to continue to work with this collection?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. The transfer process there, the black one, I'm working on the series now, digging more into perception. So morning after the deluge, I've been remaking those Turner paintings the morning after and the evening of the deluge. So I'm working on that, further affecting people's perspective by using 3D images. So what the process is now, I'm still making 3D work and 2D work, but so that glue pool I talked about, I started to accumulate that over the years. And around 2016, I was eager for another way to work with these figures. The thing about appropriation work is that I can get too stuck into the reference. Like I can get too stuck into the original photograph and not kind of expand out and be more imaginative and fantastical. So one of the urges I had was to make the full body. I was kind of restricted to their pose. So how do I make them stand up, grab things? So the collage part is an answer to that. So I took that glue pool and I applied acrylic medium on the ink side of that, which is like a liquid plastic. Painters use it to varnish their canvases for UV protection, colors, stuff like that. It comes in a fluid or a gel. I use the fluid. It comes out white and it dries clear. And I can control the thickness. I can get a thick piece or just a thin sheet of it. So I started coating that on the ink side of these glue pools. Once the medium dries, I soak it in water, and that dissolves the glue. It's water-based. So I leave the ink on acrylic medium, and I let that dry. So I have these transparencies again. These flimsy or thick transparencies. So I would tear that up and build the bodies back up. So now the figures are the bodies of new contemporary figures too. I've expanded to doing R&B figures, seminal in the genre, family members, in particular ones that have passed away. But the Bois portraits are the bodies for these new figures. So a lot of it's like carrying over this legacy and these connections. So now they're more like the DNA of what makes up the work versus just like the front of it. So now I'm making figures that are 11 feet tall, 5 feet tall, 6 feet tall. And having to do different poses and gestures. I needed to break it out of the picture and work with the arms individually or the heads and have them turn certain directions. Some of these images I have done a puppet rat tool with, so I have, like for portraits like these, even though this is a Rooks Collection one, I have extended arms digitally and turned heads and stuff like that. But I do that pretty minimally. There's a hard line in the digital work between something that's designy and something that's like a manipulation organic to the image. So I'm quite conscious of like doing something that looks kind of graphic designy into like Photoshop versus something that can look like it's more organic and manipulated intentionally or with a purpose or lack of a better word in the image. There's one portrait of Huron rebels that I like, but it's not in the show. It's just too graphic designy. I haven't resolved it yet. It's just too clean. It's just like, yeah.
Maybe you could also talk a little bit about the work that you curated from the collection here, and how, how does that change the way we read your work with the Du Bois archive? So this is a different way of working with an archive for you, right? To select images out, and I'm really interested in that. I've seen Dawood Bey has a couple of times shown his work and also been invited to curate out of a collection, and I think it's something that museums and archives are increasingly asking artists to do, but mostly photographers. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that. Like, what does it mean to situate your work within this, other archive?
Yeah, it was another way, hopefully more in a poignant way, to articulate the whole trajectory of the work that the Du Bois figures are going through. Start off with historical images, showing them in flux in the middle, 3D composite portraits, and the transitioning to, right now they're large-scale collages making up bodies, but always thought of the figures as going through a transformation visually. In one place, close to the referent, and I'm still figuring out where the end is, somewhere inexplicable. Part of the Du Bois' work, and my works too, is how do we open up depictions, photographic depictions of people, and provide multiple instances where we're not locked into strict ideas. So the show is a transition from day to day, more candid shots, primarily African-American people, beach, biker gangs dancing, Baltimoreans, day to day. The Ronald Freeman image, I descended from Africatown, formed by the last slave ship that entered illegally into the United States. Then it goes on to carrying more of a mood and a tone, where the figures are more hidden, suppressed behind light and dark. So shadow becomes much more important. The figures become much more anonymous. There's a darker tone that starts with the Wayne Bullock image of the sea palms that are drooping over. So there's art posed. Curve pose is mimicked through the skeleton, through the crier hand, the Jack Delano hands. So we start to see life, then we transition to death with the Joe Peter Wiccan image, the Christopher James image of the dead Indian gentleman, the hands of confinement with the praying hands, the Delano piece. So life and death, beginning and end, clarity and obscurity into death. So it was the articulation of the broader theme in the work for the 9 years.
Great.
And to nerd out as a photo person.
Yeah.
So she asked me how much I spent to this. We talked about this show and worked on this show for a year and a half. And I felt the way just that I really indulged. And the curators reined me in. And I went through all the photographers and every image I could find. And I sent them the first list. It was probably like 263 images. I'm like, I'm editing down, but this is like where I am, just so we're in touch and communicating. Like, we need 30. All right, cool. And that's where the refinement of the narrative came in. So I wanted to show diverse practitioners. I made sure to show some women in there too. Various aspects of Black life throughout the images too. That's a significant part. And experimental portraiture, so with the Dalis that were phenomenal, and the Lewis Hines, which is remarkable. I learned about them fairly recently, honestly too. In the middle here, we have the practitioners. We have Lewis Hines, we have Du Bois, shot by Bernice Abbott. 2 Scurlock photographs, and this is Scurlock. Created microcellular biology. Sherlock and himself, Dwayne Michaels, and importantly, George Sissel. These are people who shaped the way I think about photography in its sociological realm. In particular, I wanted to show practitioners and the photographers themselves and the scholars themselves behind the work. George Sissel today, he bought that book you were referring to, the Charts and Graphs, because the Silo came and spoke to Micah. He bought that. I couldn't go. I had a class to teach, and George Sissel, the next day showed up in Amazon and sent that book to me. Like, here it is. You didn't go, but I bought this for you. So he's been our current person that's helped me think more expansively, more thorough about photography and its importance. So that's like the influencer wall and the practitioners. I wanted to show the people behind the images significantly.
Yeah, fantastic. So something that you said about your work and wanting to kind of liberate the subjects from Du Bois's archive, right, and let them move. So the way you're working with that archive as an artist, I think, also tracks with the way a lot of scholars are thinking about archives now. And so you and I were both really influenced by Alan Sekula and The Body in the Archive, and I think that's in part why my first book was called American Archives, was really thinking with Sekula. And then I think I was really thinking about the archive as a site of power, and I still think that it is, but I think in part that's also because of the archives that Sekula is talking about, right, which are police and prison archives, right, and scientific archives.
Eugenics.
Exactly, eugenics.
I don't know if you talk about phenology in particular, but it's in that camp.
Yeah, but so really, thinking about archives that have institutional state directives that are really, they're disciplinary archives, right? They are about controlling people, right? And so I think that also influenced the way I thought about an archive and, the power relations, right? That sort of images were circumscribed by the power dynamics, that under which they were made, but also then by which they were collected and archived, right? So I think I was thinking a little bit about archives, photographs and archives being kind of stuck.
Yeah.
And I've been really excited about and influenced in my own thinking about scholarship that is suggesting that in fact archives can't contain the meaning of their materials, and they certainly can't contain or control the meaning of photographs. And so Elizabeth Edwards' book, Raw Histories, lays this out very elegantly and suggests that, it's important to recognize all of those power structures, but then to also recognize that photographs provide a kind of evidence, but they require interpreters, they require scholars and artists and activists to give them meaning, both at the time in which they're made and then later, as they circulate and persist historically. So that's been really exciting to me. Tina Campt has also recently thought about evidence, even like in mugshots, or evidence like photographic images that were made by the state and put in people's travel documents. So again, like these state disciplinary archives, and she's, I think, suggesting that, again, it's important to recognize all those power dynamics, but also that there was a person there in front of the camera. And so, even with these constraints, we have that kind of evidence of this historical subject who moved and had a life and wasn't only imaged perhaps, or certainly didn't only live within the confines of that institutional structure. So I think that some of the ways that you are really manipulating and animating the Du Bois photographs is also is getting at that, at the way that images can have other lives.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about you mentally transition from learning about the Du Bois work? Well, let me back up a little bit. How'd you get into Francis's work? From the very beginning, how did that begin?
How did that begin? So I was trained as a literature scholar. So and I worked on 19th century American literature, and I was just really interested in thinking about the formation of the middle class in the 19th century. And it was sort of through those questions about middle class formation that I started to think seriously about photography, and photographic portraiture, right? Because that was so much of the way that a middle class, or people who aspired to be middle class, kind of staked their claim to a new sort of cultural terrain, was in the photography studio. And so that just got me started on photography in my research. And then, that the photography part eventually just took over. And so now I teach at an art school, and I'm in a visual studies program, and, that's great. And really writing mostly about visual culture and photography now. But even, so in American Archives, when I wrote about Francis Benjamin Johnston, there's about 5 or 6 pages which are about the Du Bois images, right? Because I had to try to do something with them. And then, that 5 or 6 pages that just clearly wasn't enough, That's the piece that just didn't let go for me, and then became its own book.
Yeah.
So.
I'm glad I asked that because we actually began with the same topic. In grad school, doing work about my father really was about just having conversations with him. And I made activities we could do just having a conversation. They ended up being pieces, right? Art, right? I wasn't in that mindset. I got torn apart my first final review so bad, I had to back up. I'm like, all right, what's important? And I started doing my father. Then I transitioned to my grandfather, and the question was, how do they ascend to the middle class? So this Du Bois exhibition could provide answers to that. So it's always been a surrogate for my own parents and grandparents. How do they do it? Because I was in that same state too, and still am. It's how do they get a house and all these other things economically? What were the options for them? What was perspective towards them? People who had the authority for taxes and legislation, there's just a normal community. What were they kind of dealing with socially, economically, that helped or hindered their move up socially? So it was for me to answer that question where I really stuck with the Du Bois stuff.
But that's great that there's a personal connection to you too, right? So do you, is it pushing it too far to say that you even see the Du Bois collection as kind of extended family album?
No, but I think it's a little bit more twisted than that because I make him like myself. It's me.
Okay.
The trickster's me. One of the magician over there is a couple times in the show. It's me. And some of them have my cousin's name, my grandmother's name. So they're extensions, but they're also kind of surrogates for the family. So maybe say they tend to be more surrogates than extensions.
Okay, yeah. Oh, that's great. No, I love it. You're that's not quite far enough, right? Push it much further.
Is it okay if we open it up for some questions?
Okay.
I have a question. So you did create new work for this exhibition based on archival images and art collection. And you mentioned that you're making work about contemporary figures, R&B personalities, that sort of thing. Was this the first time that you had used a different archive besides the Du Bois archive for making work?
Yes, since Du Bois, so starting in 2011, yes, it is.
So how did they feel like strangers, or you know what I mean? What was the difference in the experience? And do you feel like you would do it again, or is it sort of okay, that was its own thing, but I really want to stick to the Du Bois?
No, it was really helpful and fruitful. The Rooks collection, the Ronald Rooks collection. So what's been happening in the research, Du Bois stuff, in the Bois work is that I've been trying to find instances during that period of 1850, 1899 that can explain some of the economic data on the charts. So I've been getting more specific in my research regarding Reconstruction in particular, and I've been coming across certain kind of labor instances that could help explain that. So right now I'm working on a series of portraits about the 1881 Atlanta washerwomen's strike. Domestic workers went on strike against the city and employers. And that helped spawn super organized, kind of remarkable instance, but they helped spawn movement and future instances of people forming labors and going on strike, unveiling more discrimination and unjust and violent actions in labor forces in Atlanta at that time period. So they really were seminal in fostering after them advocacy in labor organizations, unions, and people protesting and campaigning. So I'm curious if that instance can explain some things, too. Then the Ronald Rooks collection, what was great about that is that there's more specificity in the individuals. So I have a portrait of Robert Smalls. I talked about Here in Rebels already. And there are other instances where people labeled son and mother and father. So I was able to dig more specifically in history, too, where I'm at the moment as well. So now I'm thinking a lot about black legislators and labor organizers from that time period. And maybe that can help explain some of the instances of income spikes and decreases, or a percentage of job occupations during that demographic as well. The Declining Significance of Race, Changing Black Institutions by William Julius Wilson also explains some of these things too. It's like, when did federal jobs open up for black people? And there's a spike in federal jobs during World War I. Then when did it go down? And how many, the certain age group had employment and didn't. So I've been collecting over the years really specific information, economic information, and narratives to hope I can explain some of those facts. So the Ronald Rooks collection made me more specific regarding individuals, and kind of redirected me towards some seminal figures that may have helped with legislation and explain some of these things, Robert Smalls and so forth. One of the conundrums with the Bois issue I had to deal with was depicting anonymous people. I came from training in photography of the Susan Sontag. You have to be really responsible taking pictures. You can't just go out and take pictures of people as a violent act. It can be seen that way, And I actually don't photograph people a whole lot, which is why I appropriate images. And it is in part that when I was a college student, but I do not want to give Sontag that much influence on me, but I definitely was an influence. I just became more thoughtful regarding who I was depicting and why. And I always did self-portraits too, so there was always a part that's personal and an urge to depict myself in unexpected ways, because I'm quite sensitive when I was much younger towards people assuming things about me, and it was totally wrong. And I was actually much smarter and much more observant than they gave me credit for, just because I was in a certain age and demographic. They already knew what I was into, what I was going to think about. It's like, no, I'm way more eclectic than this. And it bugged me under my skin for so long, it's so profoundly that I think unconsciously, I bent on depicting myself in ways that people couldn't explain, that I expanded to other people. So hopefully we end up in a place and have an interpersonal connection that isn't really dictated on the image, but you have to contend with me to have it resolve. And all my multifacetedness, randomness, But also the other thing about the Rooks collection too is that there are photographs from a variety of photographic media. So I got to deal with brush strokes and grain and what collodion prints or tintypes versus the silver prints of the Bois. So it opened up in media-wise as well, and the depiction of these figures have expanded too, because the substrate they're on has expanded, and the way the images were made diversified too. So it really did open me up, but also make me more specific into the content too.
Shawn, you used a phrase that really stuck in my head about the research you had done on Bois and the archive and coming to a conclusion among many that it all rolled up into sociological data. The phrase stuck in my head. what might that be? And I'm imagining, in a way, maybe this will help. I know it's a little conceptual here, but if this kind of scenario were occurring in another 50 or 60 years, and two other people are sitting here and they're putting your work into a sociological, historical context, what might they say is coming out of your work as sociological data due to the processes that you've selected?
So I am addressing the charts and graphs, sociological data. Harvard has been researching the same demographic or similar demographic as Du Bois did. So I've been paying attention to that and collecting data on that as well. I have been doing tests and brainstorming a project, remaking that data as well. I'm a little reserved on the project because it's still early. So, but yeah, that's been on my mind a great deal. Look, how do I kind of articulate that through the process sociologically? I don't know if I thought about the process sociologically. I thought of it artistically. But I mean, as far as the sociological part of it, I see it as like a low-tech way to do photography. So it's really bent on legacy and generative. So hopefully they'll see me in the process as an extension of the camp that Du Bois inspired the New Negroes. But now we're more abstract and more explicable, and I'm not too bent on a finite conclusion. Hopefully they'll see it opening up and more personal actions into revising this versus more just like maybe more general common ways to do photography. Hopefully they see something a little more specific as far as like taking apart, looking at all the components, then we put all the parts back together again. But hopefully you put it back together again with something a little more contemporary, something more introspective. In an openness too, it's like, well, this isn't, like hopefully the work for them comes off as intentional and well composed, but at the same time, I do want some room. I'm not a really open-ended artist, but I do want the relationship to be a little bit more open. So hopefully they see a gap where they can interject themselves. They see how I have intellectually, sociologically want to connect legacy-wise from Du Bois and the New Negroes that he inspired after that. But hopefully in the medium too, they can see it's going through the same revisionist process. Like the photographic medium, the way I approach it, it's more low-tech and broken down. So hopefully that can come off as more accessible and more low-tech, more open too, which is why I use like glue, and it all comes from putting glue in your hands and peeling it off like a kid does. Because I did that. So I started doing glue stuff with my father. And he was in Baltimore, I was in Philly, and I wanted him physically in the work, so I would use glue because a lot of that work was about my childhood. So using childhood instances of copying him and reproducing him. And that just expanded onto photographs, and I realized I can do the darkroom in a really low-tech way. So hopefully they'll see sociologically that there's a core there and it's not too complicated. You get down to the root of it. They will get down really what it's about, and we can expand it from there. So that's hopefully what I think they take from it. But, so I guess I take that back. I do think about it sociologically. I guess it took me a minute to get there with you.